there is a theme right now when it comes to Paul George of younger players and younger people thinking so much more of Paul George in his game than the current conventional wisdom thinks. And it's a bit of a mystery. And even though I've been someone to say that the young are often wrong about things and we shouldn't just accept that they are onto something that we older people aren't onto, your writing about Paul George makes me wonder if Paul George is as underrated as you are claiming him to be. Perhaps the youth of America and the world are just understanding Paul George in a way he should be understood. Can you get into your thoughts of why Paul George is better than what people think and why this recent acquisition by the Sixers could be meaningful?
Yeah, was it, whose podcast was it where like an active player said, I think he said like Paul George is my GOAT. And I think that set a lot of people off. First of all, the idea of like, okay, we each have our personal GOATs. It doesn't necessarily mean we think they're the number one. That requires an adjustment.
Was it Carmelo's kid? Maybe it might have been.
Maybe it was. It was definitely younger.
Brandon Miller. I just looked up. It was, but there's, the thing is, there are so many Zoomers and younger who have said this that it could be a variety of people who said that. Paul George is so popular.
And that is a little surprising. And again, I wrote that Paul George has been one of my favorite players because I do like the fact that he shows up at both ends of the court. If you look at the stats, especially when you incorporate the on versus off, some of the plus minus, adjusted plus minus type of metrics, he shows up as being one of the best players in the league, especially, I mean, he still is now, but he had some years where his team was like 17 points. This was with OKC in 2019, 17 points per 100 possessions better with him on the court versus off. And again, some of that has to do with who your teammates are and who's coming off the bench for you. That's a big one. But even when you adjust that type of stuff away, which is what we did with the stat known as Raptor, I wish I could remember the fun acronym. Or no, I'm sorry, the acronym that just happened to spell out Raptor because we didn't plan that on purpose. You have to keep the kayfabe going with that. But if you looked at Raptor, I mean, he showed up as being one of the best, or maybe in the conversation of the best two-way players in the game in those years, and he still has retained a lot of that impact. And so I think that's why the stats love Paul George a lot more than if you looked at maybe something basic like a player efficiency rating where he was like just barely scraping like 19 or 20 in the past handful of years, never really had that big eye-popping MVP, kind of caliber season. That if you look at some of the stuff that tries to isolate impact on his team, that's where he shines. And so I thought it was interesting to look at what that means for the Sixers, because I had been earlier in the offseason looking at things through this prism of how much star power does a team have and how much do they need to have in order to be a championship caliber team. And you can look at that by comparing the talent, whether you want to look at Raptor, whether you want to look at any stat really, and compare that of their their number one best player, second best player, third best player to what typically is in the range of the first, second, and third best player on an NBA championship team. And traditionally speaking, you need to really check off at least two of those three boxes relative to the average champion. And typically it really probably needs to be like your number one needs to be in the high end of the range or above the median. There's some negotiability around your number three, but if your number three is toward the low end, then your number two needs to be toward the high end. And ideally, you would get three guys that would be in that range of like, we've seen this type of team win before. And when you look at those, historically speaking, Nate Silver did sort of was my inspiration for this when we worked at 538 together. He did a piece that looked at how often the teams that have this certain amount of star power win the championship. And if you have players that fit that mold, three players that fit the mold of the championship top three, big three, whatever you want to call it, you win at like a really, really high rate, at least like I want to say 50% of the time when you have players like that together. And so when you look at how the big three of this new Sixers team did last year, Embiid checks off the standard for a number one. Paul George checks off the standard for a number two, and Tyrese Maxey checks off the standard for a number three. So that's the good news for Philly. The bad news is I have not fully unpacked this looking at recent years, but my hunch is that the relationship between the big three caliber or just star power in general and winning the championship has been greatly reduced in recent years, and is part of the reason why we're in this historic stretch of we've seen 6 different champions in 6 years. That's only the second time that's ever happened in NBA history, and it's just maybe a different formula. And we've seen many of these teams try to build a big three along that paradigm and flame out pretty spectacularly, including, this is the funniest part of all, a team with Paul George as part of the big three with the Clippers. So you can't fully say it's going to work for them. And I really want to see how it works for them, because we do have this kind of counter evidence. And it's a case where if you build something around a sample that goes back a long time, I mean, the sample of looking at champions, I think we looked back to like 1977, which was, or 76, the first year after the ABA merger. It really works in history. But I think things are, because of analytics, because of just the pace at which change is happening in all of these sports, things accelerate faster. And there comes to be a point in which the best practices over the course of decades maybe don't apply as strongly as they do to the present.